Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. You can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where our guest is Chuck Rocha. I'm very excited to have Chuck on the program. Thanks so much for being here today, Chuck.
Thanks for having me.
I'm particularly excited about this because we've been talking a lot about Bernie Sanders' campaign and populism and all of that good stuff at the Federalist for months. I think we probably have, areas of where the Venn diagram overlaps on some of these issues. And so I'm actually really excited to talk to Chuck about his new book. Chuck, tell us a little bit about the book right off the bat and about your role in the Bernie Sanders campaign as well.
So the name of the book is Tío Bernie, and it's on pre-buy now. You can go to tioberniebook.com, and that's where you can see the blurbs and you can see the nice cover art that was done by as you would only expect from me, a famous Mexican cartoonist named Lalo Alcaraz in LA. He lives in East LA. He hand drew the cover of the book, and you got to see the hand-drawn Tío Bernie on the front with crowds of brown people that are drawn as well. So I really, really wanted to make the book cover and back be a piece of art. If you look closely, you can see some of my family members that are drawn in. So it was really, really a great experience on just the book cover before we ever got into the book. My role in the campaign, as many people know, I was a senior advisor and I helped build out the campaign from day one. Every employee, everything from the office space to how we put together all the different state operations to the very famous Latino outreach that we go into great detail on in the book. So if you were to say to me, Chuck, what is the book about? I would say it's two things. One, it's a very deep dive into the 2020 campaign, the Latino outreach, and some of the highlights of what happened during the campaign that nobody on the outside got to see because I was in the room, from things like the day that we had the heart attack to decisions about who was going to be the campaign manager to how we were going to deal with actually not getting a victory in Iowa when we got a victory in Iowa and what Bernie was thinking. But then the beginning of the book actually takes you through what I call my journey to Bernie, because I have such a unique story, not only being a Mexican redneck, a really brown guy with an old white man's voice, but also that I grew up in East Texas with a single mother who was 15. Many of you may not know this, but I've never been to college. I've got a criminal record. I had a child when I was 19 to carry on a long tradition of babies having babies. I've got two twin grandchildren that are 3.5. So living through an experience of working in a factory, not having an education, and learning politics through the eyes of the union, and led me through this journey in my life of making many mistakes that I talk about to kind of give advice, to end up in a place where I was so honored and so happy to get to work with somebody that reflected my values so much, which was Senator Bernie Sanders.
I think this is why people are going to be so interested in your book, because it marries this really interesting personal journey with all of your insight into the campaign. I think that's fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about your Latino outreach operation and how, give us some tidbits from the book, how it discusses that outreach operation and why it was so essential to the campaign?
I think it starts with something that people will find very interesting, which is we get all of this great credit for all the Latino groundbreaking outreach that we did. And it was historic. Bar none, it was the best operation that was ever run in the history of American politics. And I say that not to brag on me, but to brag on 206 Latinos that were on this staff. 206. Many people are like, wow, that many? Yes. And in the back of the book, I list each and every one of their names, and I thank each and every one of them because it was on their back that I built this, not me. I got to take all the credit and be out front. But it starts with that staff. It also starts with being able to do all of this historic outreach without a Latino department. There was no Latino department at Bernie Sanders because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've realized that what happens most of the time in campaigns is they'll take a women's department, a Latino department, a black department, an LGBTQ department, and they'll silo them off. They'll give them no real power, no real budget, and they never have an authority to know what's really going on. So they're kind of like window dressing. I wanted to do away with that. So because I got to help build out the campaign from the beginning with Jeff Weaver and Faz and Ariana and Ari and all of us, I got decision making on interviewing and hiring all of these staffers, right? So I go through great detail in the book talking about being very intentional about the organizing to make sure there were women and women of color running every department, most of them Latinos, because that's my network of where I know lots of people. And because of that, we built the Latino outreach program as part of the overall apparatus, which turned out to be a huge key. That coupled with starting early, having a multi-layered communication that I go into a great deal about, and then some of the back-end jujitsu of how, like, we took on the Culinary Union in Las Vegas and won by starting early and working with those workers.
I am particularly curious about that. Can you talk a little bit about, I know this is like inside baseball, but I think a lot of people are tuned in enough to politics to kind of understand how important that culinary union is in Nevada. Can you talk a little bit about how you did make inroads there? It's going up against a monster, a machine, I should say.
So people should know that the Culinary Union represents all the casinos out there. They're the service employees, the maids, the cooks, everybody out there in food service and service as there is. So they're a behemoth and they're very organized, right? And I knew, because I'd come out of a labor background, how powerful they really were. So my intentions early was knowing that we were probably never going to get their endorsement. Just because there were so many people out there. They're not a big Bernie Sanders fan, at least at the leadership. But I knew the rank and file out there would be open to hearing Bernie Sanders' message if we could get past the leadership. So my idea was to start early. And one little piece I'll tell you back from the book, that's some of the greatest strategy that we put together was, think about this. Every time you're on the road for a business trip and you're in your hotel room early in the morning, you get up and maybe you get up to go have breakfast at the buffet, or you get up to go to the gym. When you come back, sometimes if you're at that ride into the hall, the maid has already started in your room when you get back. And if you think about it, what is she doing? Well, normally if you're in Las Vegas, she's got the radio turned up, she's got your bed pulled back, she's doing her thing, but what is she doing? She's listening to a local Spanish radio station. Every time, if you think about it, she's in that room, she's got a horrible job, she's trying to think of something that makes her feel better. Well, that music makes her feel better, right? While she's having to clean this room. She can't have iPods in. She can't have earpieces in because that's restricted. So she's listening to the music on the clock radio in the room, which is not prohibited. So what I did is I started 6 months in advance advertising on that Spanish radio station, having a one-on-one conversation with each and every one of those service workers who were listening to that radio station in the kitchens, that was listening to that radio stations in the room. You couple that with sending mail to their house and serving them digital ads about who Bernie Sanders is and having a lifetime record of fighting for working people, making sure and talking about his father being an immigrant, come to this country, not being able to speak English and not having any money. I made a cultural connection and made a long-standing relationship by giving them lots of information over time, to where by the end of the day, keep in mind for you at home, 70% of this union is working class Latinos. We won 73% of the Latino vote in the caucuses in Nevada for a reason. And the funniest thing about that story is I talk about the strip caucuses on the day of the Nevada caucuses. We're literally in rooms where people are caucusing. You have the leadership of the union over here with Joe Biden screaming at people, getting people over here, and you have the rank and file of the union over here with Bernie, and they're going at each other. And we actually won 6 of the 7 strip caucuses, where 4 years before with Hillary Clinton, we lost all 7.
Wow. So that's sort of like, that must have been kind of a little microcosm of the Democratic Party right there. In a nutshell, you have the Biden people and the Bernie people, and they're kind of clashing. I'm curious, you kind of just touched on this, about what the specific outreach to Latinos, what is the message from the Bernie Sanders campaign to Latino voters? I imagine that it is maybe different depending on what Latino community you're talking to. I've heard that, particularly from people in campaigns before, that it's very different pitch if you're talking to Mexican Americans as opposed to Venezuelan Americans or Cuban Americans. So can you talk a little bit about, you just sort of touched on how you were sure to highlight that Bernie Sanders' father was an immigrant who came to this country speaking no English. What was the pitch to Latino voters from the Bernie Sanders campaign?
I'd start with making the pitch. I think, and I argue all the time with policy wonks, that it's more important to make the ask than to what you say. Because people, and I hate this, and this is what the book proves, and I talk about this, that if you want to believe that Latinos vote at the same level as everybody else, read this book. I no longer want to hear that Latinos don't vote, because we proved that wrong. And the way that we did that was not only through messaging or through what the policy positions was, but it was the targeting. There are huge swaths of Latino voters who have no voting history or who are infrequent voters because they're younger. We're 10 years younger than white and black people in this country when it comes to voting age. So we're just a younger population. So we act like young people. So we vote infrequently. And because of that, establishment consultants don't target us and don't have a conversation with us. There were 108,000 Latinos that had turned 18 and registered to vote as a Democrat in Nevada since Donald Trump had been president. And I knew nobody would target them for a caucus because it's cumbersome, it's complicated. So we did. So it's more about, Emily, about making the target and going and having a conversation with somebody who's never heard from a Democrat, they're never heard from a Republican, and you start that conversation not by, let me tell you about healthcare or let me tell you about minimum wage. You start that conversation, and every mail piece, the first time we sent it, the first TV commercial we ever did, and the first radio in every state was the same, and it was that connection to Bernie's immigrant story that says, hey, we understand. Bernie Sanders may be an old white Jewish man from Vermont, but his daddy came here with no money and couldn't speak English, just like your daddy or your grandmother or your uncle. And we made that cultural connection. And then we did it so early, we had plenty of time to say, and let me tell you about Medicare for all. And let me tell you a little bit about college affordability and making community college free. Because Latinos are very aspirational. We are truly young enough and naive enough, because we haven't been here as long, to really believe we can still accomplish the quote unquote American dream. So we talk about that in a way of how can the government assist you by doing that with Medicare for all, with free college for community colleges, and making sure you have a fair wage, like with a $15 minimum wage.
Did you ever get questions about the senator's prior position on immigration? And this is an interesting question for you, having a labor background, because that's what informed the senator's position years ago, that, immigration was something that harmed working people. Did you get questions from those voters about, I think some of those clips were circulating earlier this year, about any of his past statements on immigration, or was that something that just sort of like accepted as sincere where he is on that now?
No, not really. But the way that the reason is this is because that happened so long ago, and there was just one vote. It was in 2007. It was an immigration bill that he loves to say it, and he's right. He was on the same side as LULAC because it was a bad immigration bill, but he did vote against it. And you're right. He does use a lot of the concerns around organized labor and things back then, right?
Right.
But the thing is that Bernie had evolved to have a different conversation around that. And the people that were of age back then are such a small group of Latinos of the voting electorate. We took it on, and we thought the way to overcome that was the way that we put together the modern immigration bill that he was pushing for in the campaign, that I literally put a room full of immigrants that worked at the headquarters, and we mapped out the most progressive immigration policy ever put forward by a presidential candidate to say, yes, we voted on that then, and we voted on that this reason, but also know that this is where I stand today, and here is my policy, and here's who wrote it, this group of dreamers. So it's two-part. It's owning that and explaining what that was at that moment in time, which was a very rarely asked question because, again, we're so much younger. Average age was 27. The people, when that happened, were normally 12 years old. So they don't, but they do remember Tío Bernie and kind of like the character of who he is today. And for him to be able to stand on a stage with AOC and go, and we have the most progressive policy right now to make sure that we can make not only dreamers U.S. citizens, but their parents, and then have a path to citizenship for all immigrants.
I definitely should ask about that. How important was AOC to your Latino outreach? Because she was used pretty heavily on the campaign trail for a while.
She was critical to all of our outreach. It's funny that in Iowa, that she performed better with young white people than she did with Latinos. And it wasn't that much more, and it was a small sample size, but you should just know that she was extremely popular in a Bernie Sanders electorate, right? And let me say what I've said to reporters about endorsements. Endorsements almost never matter. And politicians love to talk about endorsements. And they do not. Take it from somebody who's run campaigns for 31 years. That I will promise you they do make no difference unless there's a small little AOC caveat. And this is what I would say, is that if you can weaponize that endorsement and put real money behind somebody who really has influence, you can do something. So that's what I did. That's what we did as a campaign, is we took her, and the next day we put her in a studio in DC, and she started making TV and digital commercials for us to serve in English and in Spanish to Latinos and white people all across those early primary states, validating a 78-year-old Democratic socialist from Vermont, right? With this smart, eloquent, pretty, brilliant Latina who every young woman saw as maybe that could be me. And every abuela out there saw that that was their granddaughter. So that's how you make that cultural connection, is you put money behind it. So we put her on mail pieces. We put her on digital ads. That's how you weaponize it, because you get that out to the masses. And when you have an old white man trying to move people of color in a younger demographic, it really helps to have a validator.
You know, that's one of the fascinating things about Bernie Sanders is that for all of the sort of chattering classes lamentations about how the Democratic Party's figureheads are old white men or women, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, it never mattered for him because he's been able to assemble this coalition of people that are really young, diverse. What do you think it is that, I mean, this sort of like, it's just kind of fascinating.
If you look across America right now, if you look at the demographics and the way people are registering to vote as they come of age, you will notice that young people, this means young black people, young brown people, young Asian people, young all crosses of all colors, they're identifying more as an independent, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican. Now, the reason for that is that they don't know anything about the party, because the parties, both parties, more so the Democrats than the Republicans, have micro-targeted themselves down into a small little clutch of voters that they rely on every cycle. You have the prime voters who always vote. Then you have this ultra small little group of swing voters where the Democrats spend all their time trying to figure out how they can get a white steelworker in Ohio who voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump to come back. They spend no time trying to talk to young black men or young brown women or young Asians and trying to get them educated on what the Democratic Party stands for and why you should be a progressive. So you see these people run to the fringes. And because Bernie Sanders is kind of a caricature and has been out there speaking truth to power so long, they saw him as somebody they could trust. And then behind that, with the campaigns that I was running with the campaign, which was all of the campaign with a group of really great people, we targeted and talked to those young people when nobody else was. They're like, oh, Bernie Sanders had this secret weapon. He could really talk to young people. I'm like, we just went and had a conversation. We spent money on digital ads targeting those young Latinos in Nevada that nobody else. So they knew Bernie Sanders because he was the only one who was having a conversation with them.
It sounds like when you have this sort of generation of people that is tending to identify as an independent, they probably are mistrustful of institutions across the board, whether it's the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the media, or whatever else, that what they look for is authenticity. And that's something that you can imagine as an easy sell from Bernie Sanders, as someone who's sort of a dyed-in-the-wool leftist his entire life. So how crucial was just the fact that he's able to kind of sell himself as an authentic person to those efforts to reach young voters?
There's lots of politicians out there that are as authentic as Bernie Sanders. But if you read this book, the Tío Bernie book, I go into great detail about how we use his the truth and the truth to power he's always used to get out to the people. So you need to be able to make that case, but to have the money, thank God for the grassroots fundraising, to tell that story to people, to say he had this position in 1961. Today, in 2020, he still has the same position, right? He just has less hair and it's more white. So we would use that, but we would also use it to actually communicate. The first time we sent a mail piece to Nevada, it was bilingual mail to Latinos. And it talked about his story, right? And it talked about, again, the immigration story, you know, and his family story. But then every other week they would get a piece of mail about like his longevity of having that true, like, he wrote the book, literally, not the Tío Bernie book, I wrote that, but he wrote the book on how you be authentic, right? And what you see is what you get. And sometimes that works against you. Sometimes he's not the most warm and fuzzy person in the room. And you're right, he's not going to be buying you a birthday cake and calling you on your birthday. So we figured out a way through strategies that I outline in the book of how we delivered the funny side of Bernie and the tough side of Bernie, right? Like we had to get that image out there. And the thing that's always moved Bernie the most, and I talk about this in the book, are these young dreamers and these young people of color. And I think that's the real transition from 07 to today with your earlier immigration question, is that he got to go out on the road for 8 years, pretty much. From that point through 2020, when he first started running for president in 2015, and he met all these young people. And the first time I ever seen Bernie Sanders cry was in front of a dreamer who was crying herself, which brought him to tears a little bit because he's such a softie when it comes to kids and his own grandkids. So I think that might have been I know for a fact it's part of his evolution on that.
That's really interesting. I actually remember, I think I saw this on your Twitter or something at the time. You were in Iowa at the Field of Dreams location. I just thought it was this beautiful Americana image of you guys all playing a baseball game.
When people ask me, Chuck, what's the most interesting story that's not in the book? There's two, and they just got cut out for time. I talked about them and wrote about them. And one was the Field of Dreams. Like, we wanted to there's a funny backstory on the Field of Dreams, which is, I thought, the reason why I wanted to put in the book. And you're the first person I'll tell this to. But it was, we were going to take on the media, and it was going to be Bernie Sanders' staff against the media at the Field of Dreams, because Bernie wanted to play on the Field of Dreams. We all wanted to play on the Field of Dreams. It was in Iowa. We could build an event around it. It was a big, concept of Ari Rabenhoff as well, who's always on the road with the senator. And I remember I didn't go on the road a lot. And I was in the office all the time running the state operations. And I was like, I'm one of the only people in this headquarters who plays softball at a competitive level. I'm going to the Field of Dreams. I'm actually going to put my foot down on this one, and I'm going. So I went to the game. And two funny things happened. One is the 24 hours before, the press all got nervous that this was going to break some kind of ethical rule because they were choosing to play with Bernie. And so they canceled themselves playing against us. And now we're stuck going to the middle of nowhere, Iowa, and we have nobody to play against. Now, I give Misty Rabick, our state director in Iowa, full credit on this, but she somehow got a local YMCA, like needy kids baseball league to come play against Bernie Sanders. So we got to play against these wonderful young kids who belong to this YMCA, and it ended up being really good, but nobody knew that 24 hours before there was going to be no softball game. And the other funny thing about that is our manager, people don't know this, Faz Secure, who was our manager, brilliant man, first Muslim American ever to manage a presidential campaign, went to Harvard, but what they don't know is that he played second base for the Harvard baseball team. In his profile picture in Twitter, if you look, Faz that's his college baseball, him hitting a baseball, and he could rake, like he was great. And I like to give him a hard time. Remember, I didn't go to college. I was an old farm boy from East Texas, but I had spent a lot of time in a cornfield, and I'd played a lot of baseball. And Faz went 0 for 3, and I went 3 for 3 and hit 2 out into the corn. So I like our time about that.
That's not so bad. The bragging rights are so important, especially on campaigns. You have to find fun anywhere.
We pick at each other so much.
So that actually brings up one of my other questions was, I think this was around November when Bernie went after the Washington Post, and there were some times when he actually was really going after the media, which is perfectly fair because the media didn't really know how to cover Bernie Sanders in the way that they don't know how to cover a lot of populists. I'm really curious about this. Is that something that increasingly resonates with Democratic voters? We know that it resonates on the right because, the media has been unfair to conservatives for generations because, a lot of cultural reasons for that. But I'm curious if that's something that resonates with kind of the Bernie Sanders voter, that especially because Bernie Sanders himself was treated unfairly by the media. Is that something that actually, really does resonate with people on the left now?
It really resonates with people on the far left who feels like that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are still all kind of controlled with big money interests,
right.
And I think that's
true.
Just true,
Yes.
right? Like, I think that as a man who's sitting here in Washington, D.C. on the backside of Capitol Hill, looking out over these row houses, that this was all like, whether you're a D or an R, there's a lobbyist wanting to give you some money for something, right? So that part of the left who really has embraced this rise of like independent media and really has caused this YouTube channel news to really explode. Those
Young
are the
Turks for you guys.
Right, Young Turks, any of those guys, right? The Hill show that now is big with Crystal and Sager, and like all of those shows have come of age under a Bernie Sanders who literally wrote the book on small dollar donations and the power of collective bargaining. We raised $200 million through like 5 million donors who gave like over 10 million different donations. That's the same model for how this independent media work of the people you're talking about, who really feel like there's nobody out there giving them their voice. It's either establishment Democrat or established Republican, and they really can't tell them apart somehow. It's easier with Donald Trump now because it's pretty easy to tell them apart.
Yeah.
But you let a middle of the road Democrat get elected somewhere and a middle of the road. I think about a Bill Clinton and a George Bush, right? George Bush got 44% of the Latino vote because he actually would have a conversation with Latinos. And Bill Clinton brought you NAFTA, which is a trade policy that all the unions and everything hated. So like back then, you couldn't tell a Democrat from a Republican by their policy by much. And you may end up getting back to that. That's why you see that frustration, especially on the left.
That's really fascinating. And that reminds me of the Joe Rogan endorsement, which for some reason was topic of conversation on Twitter yesterday. I think that was such an important, and it was kind of like an informal endorsement. It wasn't something that was like rolled out. He just kind of said it while he was talking on a show. But that stuff seems like it's really important now to capture the kind of YouTube commentators, to capture the anti-establishment grassroots stuff that's bubbling up on the left, especially. And part of this is from, you were with Bernie in 2016. I mean, part of that infrastructure started to bubble up in the years between 2016 and 2020.
I think that's why I was so intentional about writing this book and putting my story in there, because what people don't understand, right? And there's a lot of falsity on the internet and especially on Twitter, but that my story don't happen in American politics. Like, you don't realize that every consultant that works on all of these campaigns all went to a good school. They've all read the how to run campaigns through this book, and they don't understand the lens of what somebody out there on Twitter or on YouTube is going through on a day-to-day basis. I wanted people to understand being raised by a 15-year-old mother, living next door to my grandmother on a little 30-acre farm in a trailer house or a mobile home. And I talked about my mother taking me to the YMCA for swim lessons because it was free daycare for her when she went to her second job. Like, that's just real life. That's not, oh, shucks, feel bad for Chuck. I'm making the emotional connection to I am you, but guess what? I got to run Bernie's campaign. Look, guess what? I've been in trouble with the law. I've got a criminal record. Well, guess what? So does other people, but that don't have to define you for the rest of your life. Oh my God, I had a child when I was 20 that I had to take from its mother and have full custody of me, then raised in my child. So I'm a single father. So when I'm talking about making bills, making ends meet, figuring out who's going to keep my kid while I'm on the road, organizing with the union, like all of those are real life experiences that make me a dang good political consultant in my own views, because I feel like I pull from an experience that other consultants don't have. It don't make them all bad. Like all these consultants who went to Harvard and Yale and Stanford, there's some great consultants, but you have to understand that 90% of them are all white male or white female. There's very few black or brown consultants. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. It was my first op-ed. I'm a New York Times opinion contributor now. And the first op-ed I wrote was that campaigns don't look like me. And because of that, you get campaigns and public policymakers who don't understand how to capture this righteous anger and do something about it, because they're not surrounded by people who can teach them what it's like to be a black man or a brown man in today's America, and raise a young brown son who's just as hot-headed as you. So when the cops pull them over, you can say, keep your smart mouth shut and do what they say. Show them your hands. I know you ain't got to. I'm telling you, if you want to live, do that. And now I've got to worry about two little hot-headed twins, for God's sakes. Now we have double the trouble that will be just as mouthy as their grandfather. So like, that's real life that I teach politicians that I think is lost because of who represents consulting.
Well, and it's lost on both sides of the aisle. And I think excluding voices like yours who have had experiences like yours is how you end up with somebody like President Donald Trump, the host of The Celebrity Apprentice, because it's like there was this desperation of people who didn't feel heard. And I'm really glad that you're writing for the New York Times now, because the New York Times is a good example of a place that, like, are there some people that have interesting backgrounds in terms of class, in terms of race? Yes. But that is a paper that is run by coastal, people who went to like big coastal schools, fancy coastal schools, and have similar experiences to one another. And I don't care if it's the left or the right, but they need to include working class voices. They need to include diverse voices. And that's a huge problem. And it's not just a problem in the media. It's a problem, like you said, even in the consultant class. And that's particularly interesting because that's not a place where I have a lot of experience, but I imagine that it's populated by the same kinds of people that run this city where you and I both are in right now.
It really is, and it's really the root of all the problems with both of the parties, is that, and I talk about this in the op-ed, and I allude to this in the book in several chapters, is there's not an entryway. As I've learned, and I'm the senior most brown person in DC in politics, that means I've just seen a whole lot, made a lot of mistakes. But if you're a young black or brown kid, or a young white kid who's broke, who don't have any wealth, who comes from a family who never went to college, if you don't have connections, you know this, you can't get a job in this town. Now, what you might can do is you might can get a free internship. You might can get some kind of a free fellowship. But you know as well as I know, if you come from no wealth, how do you sustain yourself in a city that's so expensive when your entryway is some free internship or some free fellowship? So at my firm, Solidarity Strategies, we're the largest Latino-owned firm in DC. We've become a consulting firm / incubator. So if you're a young black or brown kid and somebody normally will tell you to come see Chuck Rocha if you're looking for work, if I've got an open desk, I'll pay you $500 a week and pay your bus fare and help you as much as I can, but I will call you an associate. And I will get you your first job. Within 6 months, you then have experience at the Chuck Rocha firm, Solidarity. You were an associate, not an intern, and then you can get that first job here, still underpaid at probably $40,000 or $45,000. Being some kind of junior person on the hill.
Yeah, another thing that's so important, I think we probably both agree on the importance of having paid internships or paid starting positions, because if you don't, the gateway for so many working class people is impossible into the city. It's amazing how the mechanics of one city like Washington, D.C., or you can include New York in that, have so many implications for politics around the country, because it's just hard to get your foot in the door here if you don't come from a certain background.
I'll tell you exactly how hard it is if you want to put a modern picture on it. There are amazing progressives of color who just got elected in this last primary. Some crazy upsets with Mr. Bowman in New York and other places, Mr. Booker almost winning in Kentucky. And you have all of these amazing black and brown and gay and women who are running for office and upsetting the apple cart, much like AOC did. Well, even those consultants who work on those campaigns are the same white establishment left-wing consultants in our world. Like, as much as we love to call out the right, not that they're racist, they're not racist at all. They're just a bunch of, how would I say this, well-meaning woke white folks is what they are, right?
Right.
And I like to tweet out all the time to mess with people, especially brown and black people, is that woke white consultants will not save us, right? As much as well-being as they mean to be, and many of them are my greatest friends and allies, they just don't understand what it's like to be a convicted criminal and trying to work in this industry. They don't know what it's like to be judged on your skin color when you walk into a place, because I'm 6'1", I'm bald-headed, I weigh 210 pounds, I'm a menacing figure until you get to know me, but I get judged on what I look like before I ever open my mouth. And normally when I then open my mouth, they're like, what the hell is that? Because he sounds like he just walked in off the hayseed farm.
That's really funny. Well, so the woke white consultant thing is very interesting, and of course I'm white. I'm not super woke, but I am white, and I'm wondering if this conversation that is happening on the left right now do you think that it's being driven by not just woke white consultants, but also sort of like the woke white pundit class? And maybe it's divorced from actually dealing with what the working class is dealing with on the ground. When we're spending all of our time talking about, and I acknowledge fully this is a complicated conversation, but when we're spending all of our time talking about Mount Rushmore and talking about statues and talking about the figure on the face of Uncle Ben's rice, is that something that people in the working class on the left tune out? Is it something that hurts the Democratic Party's ability to reach people, or is it something that they're legitimately interested in?
I think it's a combination. I wish I could tell you that it was yes or a no answer, but it's not. I think those symbols are important to deal with, and I'm not saying you're minimizing those, but it's not just that. You're right. But I think it's a larger problem of all of those folks have moved so far to the left in the way that they think about organizing in an absolute manner, is that they're not good at strategy. Now, some of them have still won races because some of these establishment Democrats have run just such horrendous campaigns of just like wanting to run TV commercials. But the way Bernie Sanders, who is the perfect example of how to run the perfect campaign, even though we are not the president, but for those of you out there who study politics, there's no reason that Bernie Sanders should have even got this close. And with this last election, we were literally 3 weeks from being the nominee till everybody woke up and knew the same polling that we did. I go into great detail on this in the book. that after Nevada, we were winning every Super Tuesday state. Every one of them. We were fixing to be the nominee, and the establishment Democrats all knew that, and somebody got on the horn and said, okay, girls and boys, this shit is over. It's time for all of us to get behind somebody, because Bernie Sanders is fixing to walk away with this if we keep splitting up the vote. So they consolidate. He gets his bump in South Carolina, and then Bloomberg gets out, and the rest is, as they say, history. Like, this thing was handed to Biden. He's going to beat Donald Trump. I'm going to fully support him. We've got to get rid of Donald Trump. And I'm just saying, this is one example. Yeah. Bernie Sanders had a true grassroots army that could do this relational organizing, do peer-to-peer texting, have all these volunteers making phone calls. And people like to say that's the reason he had such a great campaign. No, that's just one of the reasons. What they don't realize is that Bernie Sanders also ran millions and millions of dollars of TV commercials. He ran millions of dollars of radio commercials. He ran the most historic Latino outreach program. He ran tons and tons of digital ads. We did all the things. That's how you win a campaign. You've got to do the grassroots. You've got to do the relational organizing. You've got to do peer-to-peer organizing on the ground. But you also got to be able to go talk to the masses about, it's kind of how the Republicans got Donald Trump elected, is their digital targeting and their TV targeting was just like a shotgun. For you non-rednecks, that means a very broad net. And they were going after lots of people, those Republicans who hadn't been talked to in a long time, who had never showed up. That's why they had such a spike in turnout with new voters, is because they were talking to lots of people.
And Chuck, so this is so interesting because you hunt and you fish, like you've held a gun, which already makes you different than so many people here in DC that work on the left and on the right. And it's just, I think your background is so fascinating and how you came to, you went through the labor movement. Let me ask you about the labor movement. Do you think there's a resurgence of the labor movement right now? Do you think that there's any possibility? I mean, Joe Biden released a plan just this week about how the labor movement can be folded into the sort of clean energy movement. What do you think the future of the labor movement looks like right now?
I think as long as you have people with power they're always going to be adherent to their board of directors and their stock prices more so than their workers. So there's going to be a need for representation and collective bargaining. I know I keep pivoting back to this book, and I should, and you should go to TioBernieBook.com and buy this book. But I talk extensively about starting out as a factory worker in East Texas and becoming a union steward, and then becoming a chief steward, and then working to represent my men. And it was all men in my department. We made tires for your car. But it was learning how collective bargaining worked for me, right? As a kid who never went to college, who just knew it wasn't fair for them to skip you for overtime because the boss didn't like you and move on to this other person. I actually could bring justice to that and say, no, you have to go back and pay him, and now you have to pay him double because you skipped him. I wasn't trying to, all I'm trying to do is have fairness. I'm the fairness cops. So when I say collective, and I describe collective bargaining in that way, because I'm one of the only probably the only political consultant in DC, again, to your point, who's actually worked in a factory, who's actually been a union steward on the shop floor. Keep in mind, I spent most of my time representing the same 5% of goofballs who always messed up too. So I get that part of the union as well and see that. But there's going to always be a place for collective bargaining, in a place where you have lots of money, because money will always throw the labor as just a commodity and not as a human resource.
So Chuck and I have been on TV together before, and one thing that is great about Chuck is he has a sense of humor. As you've probably been able to tell from this conversation, he has a sense of humor. Do you think, Chuck, that the left needs to have a better sense of humor? This is something that, and maybe we disagree on this, but I think, there's I guess you could maybe call it political correctness. That might be kind of a cliched term for it. But do you think the left needs to kind of let loose and, I'm genuinely curious about this. I don't know what the answer is. I would assume that people are, more open to just laugh and, be comfortable having open conversations. I think that's why the podcast industry is booming right now, because people on the left and the right just want to have open, honest conversations that are unshackled by political correctness, frankly. But do you think that, the left needs to kind of relax on some of this stuff, or do you think it's actually really important?
It's an important human connector. How many times have you tuned into some left-leaning radio host or TV channel and laughed? Think about it. You haven't. Right? Mm-hmm. Laughing is a way people release something inside of them, right? And to me, again, in this book, I talked about my need to want to please, because my father left when I was so young, and I want the approval of people. But I was also a fat kid when I was young, right? I was 300 pounds when I graduated high school. And I knew that the only way I could ever get a girl to talk to me it wasn't going to be because of my physique, which was 300 pounds of twisted steel and not great appeal, but it was going to be being funny. Like the greatest people to get to know later in life, let me give you some dating advice, is date a fat girl or a fat boy who was fatter back in their day, because they've learned to have a better personality. It's those kids that were pretty all their lives who never had to be, nice or congenial or show respect. It's the same in consulting. Like these folks have been handed what they have, and the people on the left are smart as hell, and they're used to being the smartest person in the room, but they're not used to having to use their personality to get people to like them. Like I needed people to like me, so I wanted to be funny. I wanted you to like me. But on the left, there's a way to do both, right? And we use that in the campaign because Bernie, look at the cover of my book. It's literally a cartoon character.
Right.
And I did that on purpose, right? I didn't want it to be Bernie Sanders, a real picture in a crowd and him scowling like he always was scowling. No. I literally remember going back to the artist with the book cover. Here's a little insight that I'll only tell you, the world today, is I said, they had him frowning because they had drew him as a picture in one of his rallies. I said, no, make him look happier and make him look skinnier. Like, I don't want a fat, angry Bernie on my cover. So you got to think about like what is appealing to people. And I think we would be so much better served on the left if we had more of a personality, if we were more lighthearted about things, if we talked about things, in the way that, making fun almost of how crazy we think about certain things. Nothing's an absolute, but making a human connection, you would get a lot more of these young people to be with you if you make that human connection. Make yourself a little more vulnerable, open yourself up. I make fun of myself all the time, not just to make you laugh, because that's who I am. I've had to learn, in lack of me going to Harvard or Yale, that I am this amazing looking Latino. Like if I keep my mouth shut, I look like a Latino, brown, guayivera, like I'm wearing a Mexican shirt right now. A barber shirt's what they call these. This is a very Mexican shirt. But I also know when I open up my mouth, I sound like my white grandfather who raised me, right? And I also know that yesterday when I was doing a pitch for a guy in Tyler, Texas, where I'm from, who's running against Louis Gohmert, who said, when I said to him, this was my closing pitch for him to hire me to help, I said, sir, I'm the only political consultant in Washington, D.C. who's ever cranked a tractor from the front. And he was like, good God, you're hired.
Yeah, so I bet.
Because my granddaddy had an old farm-all tractor that the battery wouldn't work on, so it had one of them old tiller. You had to crank it like you see in the movies, and that was a real thing. So use your strengths. Don't be scared to be funny a little bit or be vulnerable. People like that.
Well, and what I like about what you just said is it gets back to the conversation we were just having, which is that if you grow up between the coasts and, not in these sort of wealthy families, you have different life experiences, and different life experiences are important because, that means you can speak to different people with some knowledge of where they're coming from. I want to ask, this is kind of my closing question, is as somebody who has traveled the country, you've been to, I assume, almost every single state, and in the context of a campaign, as somebody who grew up in Texas, working class, who's kind of gone through the whole kind of ladder climbing process, what is amazing about this country from your perspective? What should, to the left, what is, we talk so much about how we need to improve, and that's because the country does actually need to improve in many ways, and we may have different perspectives on what those ways are. But what is great about this country from your perspective as somebody who has been to just about every corner of it and who grew up in Texas and is now in Washington, D.C.?
There's certain things that tie us all together, and it's easy to say. I remember working for Dick Gephardt back in '04, and he used to stand and say, we're all connected. We're all tied together, in the old Dick Gephardt way. Well, there's certain things that connects us, and people think, how would a Mexican immigrant, how would a Venezuelan immigrant, how would an African immigrant, a Korean immigrant, a good old boy from Alabama, an Italian second generation in New York, like what connects all of those people other than like the soul of the American dream, right? My deep dive into knowing people, which is my job as a political strategist, is there's certain elements of our culture that really tie us together. And here's 3 examples for you to use, and all you junior consultants out there, is that there's 3 things. First is family, next is food, and the third is music. Family will always tie people together at some level, some stronger than others. In the Latino world, it's the grandmother. It's very much tied together, but everybody's family, and there's a matriarch normally. Black families, oh my God, in the South, like think about that. Even redneck white families who get together like my folks did in Texas, or that Italian family in New York who gets together for their grandmother's sauce, which is spaghetti sauce for you folks, in their apartment in New York City. Like that family element, that's a key part of culture that we all have in common. The next thing is music. People love music. It may not be the same music, but you have Latinos listening to this great Mexican music. You have these rednecks listening to this country music. You have merengue and salsa and all these other musics. Like music is something that, again, makes people happy and makes people, it makes them go away to a different place, right? So that music, family, and oh my God, food, right? Like food is just something that is going back to our caveman days. We would gather in caves and have food, and it was something that brought us together. If you can stay in those avenues around family, food, and music, that's the greatest part of our country, is that we come from so many places, but those three things bring us together at our best all of the time. And we should be talking more about music, food, and family if we really want to find commonality.
That is beautiful, Chuck.
Not bad for a redneck poet from East Texas.
Well, no, the redneck poets are the best poets. Hillbilly Shakespeare, Hank. That's good stuff.
My new hashtag is Dirt Road Democrat, but go ahead.
I love that. Chuck, thank you so much for your time today. The book is Tío Bernie. I assume that's available pretty much everywhere, right? Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the good places.
Now it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and you can buy them both at TioBernieBook.com.
TioBernieBook.com. And Chuck, where can people follow you on social media?
It's at Chuck Rocha. Like my team cringes because I call it the Twitters and the Instagrams. On the Instagrams, it's Chuck_Rocha, and on Twitter, it's at Chuck Rocha.
All right. Well, thank you. Everyone, make sure to get out there, go to TioBernieBook.com. Chuck, we really appreciate your time today. This has been another episode of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.